Hi everybody, it's great to see so many people out today. I know the weather's not like we would like it to be, but it's great to see folks around. And I think you'll find this project really interesting, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, but towards the end I'll talk a little bit about ways that if you're interested in getting involved, there are still possibilities for folks to get involved in the project itself. So my name is Andy Clarno. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies here at UIC. And along with Neil DeFlores Gonzalez, Maria Creason, and Pam Populares, I was one of the co-PIs on this project. The Chicago area study is this was a multi-year, multi-method research project that we carried out between 2010 and 2012, analyzing how localities in the Chicago area have responded to high levels of immigration from Latin America over the last 30 years. We incorporated undergraduate students, graduate students, and faculty in the research process. It was a big project. I'll tell you a little bit about the data at the end. We've got a tremendous amount of data, and it's a lot of projects happening based on this data right now. The project itself is funded by the CAS, the NSF, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the IRRPP here at UIC. Right. So overall, what we tried to do with this project is looking at how these localities have responded to high levels of immigration and trying to make sense of why it is that certain communities adopted very welcoming, supportive policies, and others more neutral, and others very aggressive and antagonistic policies, restrictive immigration policies. So what I'm going to do is just kind of briefly give you an overview of the project itself, and then we're going to have 5 presentations today. First, Maria Creason is going to speak about immigration ambivalence in Suburbia. Neil DeFlores Gonzalez on educating Latino students. Pam Populares on social networks of immigrants. These 3 were, along with me, the co-PIs of the project. And then 2 of the graduate students who've been involved are going to be speaking about some of their research. Emily Reese did research on undocumented youth, which she's going to share with you, and Vanessa Gurdy did some research on political incorporation of immigrants in Suburbia. So these are going to be 5 short presentations, just to kind of give you an overview of some of the things that are happening, and then we can talk about the project as a whole. So this project was driven by the rapidly growing immigration over the last 30 years, and the fact that immigrants are ending up in new destinations, not the traditional urban gateways. Because of the lack of immigration reform at the national level, and because of national policies that are promoting local governments to take more of a role in immigration policing, you've got all kinds of local policies that are being adopted, some very supportive and others more restrictive. And these policies have everything to do with housing, education, employment, language, law enforcement, you name it. Right? There's policies that are being adopted by local governments at the state, county, and municipal level, trying to determine how do they respond to the growing number of immigrants in their communities. But there's a huge disparity in these local policies. I mean, everything from Arizona SB 1070, or the policies adopted in Hazleton, to policies that protect day laborers or provide in-state tuition for undocumented students. So the question that was really getting at us is what drives localities in particular directions? And that's just not clear. So that's the research question that we set out to answer. How, why, and when do new destinations adopt supportive, neutral, or restrictive immigration policies? And what we wanted to do is look at the interplay between public and private actors, between the city council, the electorate, public institutions, as well as social movements, service providers, voluntary associations, businesses, and financial institutions, to look at that kind of interaction between these different actors and how that plays out in different localities. There have been a lot of previous studies on this phenomenon of new destinations or new gateways. But most of them have looked at places in the South or the rural Midwest. They haven't really looked at areas near traditional immigrant gateways, like Chicago itself. And so what we wanted to do is look at a traditional gateway, like the CMA. So that's why we decided to focus on the Chicago metropolitan area. It's a traditional immigrant gateway surrounded by satellite cities, suburbs, exurbs, rural areas, all of which are seeing an increase in their immigrant populations. The Chicago metropolitan area has the third largest concentration of Latinos in the United States, the second largest concentration of Mexicans. And by 2000, and this was really important for our study, by 2000, 54% of Latinos in the Chicago area were living in the suburbs, not in the city. And so we're trying to understand what's happening, how are they being received in the different cities and around here. So within the Chicago metropolitan area, we ended up looking at Lake County, which is just north of Cook County, between here and the border of Wisconsin, which has seen a 240% growth in the Latino population since 1990. Latinos live in a wide variety of locations, and it's really a microcosm of the different responses to the immigrant population. Within Lake County, we looked at 5 different communities. So first, we looked at Waukegan, which is historically it's a largely white working class city. It's also the largest city in the county and the county seat. By 2007, it was 53% Latino. And this is the city that's adopted the most aggressively antagonistic exclusionary policies in the county. So we were able to study some of that and what's driving that process. Next, we looked at North Chicago, which is it's a suburb of Waukegan. It's just south of Waukegan. It's historically a black-white suburb. It's now basically has the same demography as Chicago, 30% white, 30% black, and 30% Latino. It's got a disappearing industrial base and is also the home to a large military base. And the mayor there is black, and they've had a neutral stance towards immigrants, so it was an important place to look at. Next, we looked at Highland Park and Highwood, which are down here towards the southern end of Lake County. Highland Park, is a very wealthy white suburb of Chicago. Only 7% of the population is Latino. It hasn't grown very much over the last 20 years. But the city shares a middle school and a high school with Highwood, which is right next door. And Highwood is it's a working class immigrant neighborhood, historically largely an Italian neighborhood, a city that provided low-wage labor to the wealthy suburbs around it. And over the last 30 years, there's been a rapid increase in the Latino population, which is now over 50%, doing the same jobs that Italian immigrants used to do. So getting a sense of that dynamic between the wealthy suburb and the working class residential suburb was very important for what we were trying to do. Next, we looked at Round Lake. There's a series of communities around Round Lake that were formerly set up as kind of lake houses for the Chicago elite, the upper classes. But since 1980, this number is from 2007, I think, 1,200% increase in the Latino population. But at the same time, these communities have been the most inclusive and welcoming in the entire county. And then we spent just a little bit of time in Wakanda, which is a rural community on the edge of Lake County, where a lot of agricultural laborers work. So while each of these presents kind of a compelling case on its own, together they created this really interesting opportunity for us to do some comparisons. So I had some pictures, but they're not on board. The research itself took place in basically 3 stages. In 2009, we collected newspaper archives to give us a kind of a sense of these different communities. Then the 2 big projects were the CAS 2010, which took place in the spring and fall of 2010. And we developed and conducted an attitude survey, getting people's attitudes about immigrants and immigration policies. And we also began to collect some preliminary qualitative research. And then in 2011, the focus was on ethnographic and qualitative research with city officials, voluntary organizations, professional organizations, schools, businesses, etc. Just to give you a little bit more detail about what we have here. So from the 2010 CAS, we collected more than 1,000 surveys of residents over 18 in these different cities, conducted in person or by phone, in either English or Spanish. The survey covered a wide range of issues, from people's perceptions of their neighborhoods and communities, their networks and voluntary association participation, their attitudes towards immigration, their political activities, their attitudes about various different groups, these kinds of questions. And all of that data is there. The following year, in 2011, 451 in-depth interviews were conducted, ranging from 15 minutes to 3 hours, with residents, businesses, nonprofits, activists, schools, local government officials, police, a huge range of people. 451 interviews are there in the same communities. And this is important for people who might be interested in getting involved. All these interviews have been transcribed and masked. Most of them have been coded and are searchable in terms of the type of actor that we talk to, the location and language of the interview. And most of the content has been basically coded as well, whether they talk about things like business, education, healthcare, labor, government, gentrification, all of these types of issues. There's an easily searchable code to tell what each interview talks about. This project has already produced a huge range of projects. There have been 9 MA papers, 3 dissertations, several publications, more than 30 presentations, several community workshops where we've taken the data back to Lake County to share it with the communities on a huge range of topics, right, which you'll hear about several of them today. But we wanted to just kind of make this pitch here that we do encourage and welcome people who are interested in taking part in using some of this data for their own research projects. There's a tremendous amount of data here, and we've only really skimmed the surface of what's there. So if people are interested, please contact us. Maria's email and Nilda's email are here. You can also reach us through Teresa. We'd be happy to tell you more about what we have and help you get involved. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce Maria Creason, who's going to talk about some of the work she did.
All right. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. So what really is going to follow, you're probably looking at the number of people that are going to talk and thinking we're crazy, but we're really providing teasers for you of the array of kinds of data sets that we have available, and some teasers about the results so that you can see what we have and where we're headed with this, and where, as Andy ended with, where you could possibly get involved if you're interested in exploring some of these things. The other, I want to just make a short pitch for, this is part of what's called the Chicago Area Study, which is a broader initiative that collects data every other year. And this is one of the huge success stories of that initiative. The goals of that initiative are to provide basic social science research, engaged scholarship, and graduate student training. And as you're about to see in these presentations, I hope you'll see that this CAS is succeeding in all of those. We have research presentations that are more engaged, some that are more basic social science, some that are somewhere in between. We have faculty, and we also have graduate student presenters that we're very proud of. So this is a nice example of, and if you have more questions about the Chicago Area Study as an initiative, I also want to encourage you to get in touch with me. I'm the director of that initiative. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you the teasers from the survey data that was conducted in 2010. As Andy indicated, the context in which the study was done is a great one for studying and trying to understand how communities experience rapid increases in immigrant populations. And he also alluded to the fact that the interesting questions here are related to the fact that the national immigration policy scene has kind of created a vacuum into which local and state and community municipal policies have had to insert themselves, and that those policies can be, they can prevent, reverse, or in some cases encourage immigration. So my goal in this survey, giving you this brief review of the survey in particular, is to give you one window into the context in which these policy debates and policies, and also some of the other work that you're going to hear today, is operating. And because I set a very strict 10-minute time frame for everybody, I'm going to give you the punchline first, and then I'm going to go back and show you some of the data that lead to the punchline. So the punchline is that in our survey data of native-born residents of Lake County, there's deep ambivalence about immigration. Immigrants and immigration are simultaneously admired, resented, and distrusted, but they're part of the fabric of the community life for the residents that we talk to. They're neighbors, coworkers, employees, and friends. Immigration policy attitudes themselves, when you look at the array of kinds of policy attitudes, are deeply ambivalent as well. Some restrictive measures are wildly supported, and some supportive measures are wildly supported. So this is what I'm now going to show you, run through some of the data to give you the backdrop or the reasons I'm making those claims. To review, I'm not going to review what Andy just told you about the first 8 points on this slide. Really, the bottom slide is the only one I want to highlight for the purposes of my talk, which is that the data that I'm showing you I've excluded any immigrants as respondents. So I'm just giving you the native-born Lake County resident responses to these questions. So it's mostly whites and African Americans and a handful of Latinos who are native-born, who I'm showing you the data from. The other thing I want to note is that normally I'm actually a huge hater of what I'm about to do, which is just to show you the frequency distributions of these variables. Because as a methodologist, I could tell you for 3 hours, I could give you a lecture about why you should distrust the frequencies of questions. The question wording impacts things, the mode, all kinds of things change the level of support and opposition. But actually for this talk today and for this policy brief that we wrote, the point of it is to show the range of responses across answers. So really the comparison is not group to group, but it's across all of these different issues. You'll see the levels going up and down and hopefully conveying to you the ambivalence. The second purpose is that I can then run through a bunch of questions and you can start to see some of the kinds of survey items that we had. So the first story I want to say is that not only has there been a tripling of the size of the immigrant population since 1980 in Lake County, but native-born Lake County residents report lots of contact with Latinos, whether it's talking to them in their neighborhoods or working with them in their place of employment. You can see if you look at the top two, the orange and the blue, that 70 and 80-some% of native-born Lake County residents report every day, between every day and a few times a month, contact with Latinos. So it's very rare to have someone say they never, or extremely rare, unlikely to talk to or work with Latinos. Despite this contact, or perhaps because of it, there is a mixed bag in terms of the perceptions that native-born residents have about Latino immigrants. On the one hand, there's this slide, which shows the percentage of respondents who report that Latino immigrants are very or somewhat hardworking. I don't normally see 99% of native-born Lake County residents that agreed that Latino immigrants are hardworking. And 70% agreed that Latinos want to learn English. So there's very positive, these are kind of traditional stereotypical measures that people put in surveys to measure people's attitudes, and there's overwhelmingly positive impressions of Latino immigrants for those two questions. Simultaneously, however, despite this admiration for Latino immigrants, native-born residents resent certain aspects of Latinos. You can see that more than half of report thinking that Latino immigrants take jobs from American workers or use too many government services. So simultaneously, admiration plus perceptions of the negative impact of immigration on them. So we have these kind of simultaneous stories here. Also complicated is the story about whether native-born residents see immigrants as helping, hurting, or having no effect. So one way, the far left column is perceptions that respondents have about the effect of Latino immigrants or immigration on the U.S. economy, on the quality of public schools, and on overall quality of life in the community. And you can see the percent who say it hurts varies across these different issues. One way to read the data is that more than half think immigration impacts negatively the U.S. economy, and nearly a majority perceive that they have a negative impact on schools. Another interpretation is that a majority of native-born residents view immigrants as helping or having no effect on their community and life and school quality. So probably the most complete reading is that Lake County native-born residents are split in their view on immigration, tending to believe it has adverse effects on the overall economy, but minimal impact on the quality of life in their community. One of the features of our study that I think is unique is that unlike lots of surveys of immigration, we have, this is not even all of them, what are there, 5 here? There's probably 3 3 times or 4 times more questions about different policies related to immigration. These questions vary from national policies to local policies. They vary from policies about immigration in general to policies about undocumented immigrants. They range from punitive policies to supportive policies. I've selected 5 of them here, again to sort of beat a dead horse here at this point about the ambivalence, that the levels of support or conversely opposition to these policies really varies. There's a lot of ambivalence. There's some policies that are punitive on the far left, those that turn local police into immigration people. What do you call it? The immigrants. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that. 68% favor that punitive policy of giving police those responsibilities, if you will. A majority support increasing efforts to deport undocumented immigrants. Somewhat less support worksite raids. But then you get down here to these other 2. These are positive policies. These are positive, if you will, policies, supportive policies to help immigrants start new businesses, and the DREAM Act. Those actually reverse where there's overwhelming support for those kinds of policies. So in other words, immigrant policies are not monolithic. Restrictive policies, to be sure, are endorsed, though there is some variation in the extent to which they're endorsed by very substantial numbers of native-born residents, but there's also striking level of support for programs that give immigrants a helping hand. So I could talk a little bit, but I'm attentive to my time here, about the other variation in terms of education and racial background. We can talk, you guys can ask me that question during Q&A. I want to reserve time for the rest of the speakers. But there's some, I can speak a little bit about how those questions that I just reviewed with you look differently for blacks, whites, and Latinos, and look differently for those with a college degree and those without a college degree. But lastly, the national data sets, I want to sort of put a plug on this use of a local data set. The national data sets that we typically rely on to study immigration attitudes and which shape the public debates about immigration policy include people who live in communities with lots of Latino immigrants, but they also include a lot of people who live their daily lives very far removed from population centers where Latino immigrants have settled. So the CAS, the 2010 CAS, provides a rare glimpse into a representative sample of respondents whose communities have most certainly been touched by this recent wave of immigration. These are individuals who are living around, working with, and employing in great numbers Latino immigrants. Our portrait reveals a level of ambivalence that belies the often stereotypical views on immigration attitudes that are portrayed in the media or by political pundits. While ambivalence could be a sign of indifference or uncertainty about the role of immigrants in American life, it likely reflects recognition on behalf of Native residents that immigration both contributes to and challenges major U.S. institutions in important ways. So I'm going to close there, but not without first saying one thing I forgot to say at the very first slide, which is one of the co-authors of this is a graduate student here, Patrick Washington, and then a colleague who was here for a minute about 4 years ago, Matt Hall, was also a co-author on this publication, which you can get off of the website at IGPA if you're interested in. So there. No, you don't have to clap. You don't have to clap. The next speaker is going to be Nilda Flores-Gonzalez, who is the another of the co-principal investigators on this project. And she's going to talk about education in Lake County.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm going to be talking, one of the things that, Andy and I concentrated on was on looking at some of what are some of the challenges that these communities were facing as they were seeking to integrate immigrants. And the particular area, at least for these, and this ended up, part of this presentation ended up in a publication with, we did a collaborative project with some colleagues in Madrid. The lead person there has spent some time here in the great cities. He had come for a semester to UIC, and he created this project in which we were comparing policies toward immigrants in Chicago and in Madrid. So part of what I'm going to talk about has to do with that, but I'm going to talk more generally about some of the sort of 10 findings. So the main research question in terms of education that I was looking at is like sort of what are the challenges faced by new destinations in Lake County in educating immigrant students. And besides that, I also wanted to look at for the effects because of this project with Spain, these were legal scholars that wanted to look at policy And so I started looking at sort of the policy side of how practice happens, right? So how federal, state, and district policies affect immigrant education through that project. And then, but then I think really the meat of these, because that you can find anywhere, you know, there's a lot of things written about federal and state intervention, but really what is really neat about our data is that we really got to tease out sort of how these policies are translated into practice, what happens in the day-to-day life of these kids in schools. So, as you know, the challenges of these new destinations is that not only do you have an increase in population, that brings a lack in the infrastructure, and particularly I was looking at schools, how schools have limited funds, and now they have this new population, and it's not only population in numbers, but it's a population that has particular needs, you know, so there are language, cultural, and social barriers that the school now all of a sudden has to address, right? From being schools that were pretty much monolithic white to being schools that became predominantly Latino within a 10-15 year span. So this was a big challenge for these communities. And also there was a lack of bilingual professionals that we found in these schools. So again, the data that I used for this and is public documents. I just search, you know, school report cards, district documents and things like that, but also, you know, the interviews that we did in the schools and the observations that we did at the various schools there. Very quickly, you know, in terms of federal policies, one of the things, and actually what we published in the chapter that we have in this book, in which I co-authored with 4 students and Irma Armedo, who's an emeritus faculty. In that chapter, we looked at sort of federal, state, and local policies, so it had more of a policy aspect rather than more of the day-to-day practice. So, but in terms of the federal policies, these federal policies are very broad. They establish very broad policies to protect the rights of children, but they leave the design and the implementation of educational policies to the states and to the local level. And these results, like Maria said, in these vast inequities and disparities, and Andy mentioned this, these differences in how education happened in different districts and schools. At the state level, you know, the states set up the standard of, you know, making sure that districts comply with minimum requirements. But again, it also leaves a lot of what happens to the school districts, up to the school districts. It checks for compliance and regulation and only intervenes when things are not going well, right? But I don't want to spend too much time in that. Rather, one of the things that I want to stress is when we looked at the particular districts, and we went and talked to the district, to the superintendents, and as well as individual schools. And so what we found is some of the main things, and there's 4 things, and I will illustrate, I will just give 2 examples of this, but there was great disparities in terms of funding. There's also great disparities in terms of where Latinos concentrated in neighborhoods and what schools they went to because of residential segregation, and which suburbs they went to live versus others. There was issues with tracking, assessment, bilingual programs, the kind of bilingual programs that were offered, the administration and school leadership, particularly the racial ratio, and also teachers, and then the needs of parents and students that were not met. So overall, what we found is that these districts were really ill-prepared to meet the educational needs of Latino, and particularly the immigrant population. And so what I want to tease out is just 2 things, like to give the teasers, like Maria says. One is that one of the things that we found is that, and this is not great news, right? We know that community wealth and school funding really matters, but we saw how that translated into everyday life and how that really translated into some districts and doing better than others. And the other thing is that attitudes, also from Maria's work, that the attitudes that the leaders in the community have and the residents have had a lot to do with how education was shaped for these students, and the kinds of local, you know, the local politics and the attitudes really had a lot to do with what was available for these students in these schools. So just to show you really quick, these are sources of funding for each of the districts. So you can see that it's like, you know, it's like the reverse. So the last two to the right are Highland Park. One is the elementary school district, the other one is the high school district. There's North Chicago, Waukegan, Round Lake, Wakanda. 60% is sort of the mean local funding for schools, and you can see that many of these schools surpass. And one of the things that is deceiving when people look at this, I have other graphs that I won't show, but one of the things to keep in mind is that schools get a formula, right? They get allocated money per student, and there's certain formulas that account for low income and students like with disabilities, but schools pretty much get the same amount of money per student, right? And so what was happening in some of these communities, particularly Highland Park, is that the wealth of the community, they were able to flush a lot more money into the schools. So the year that we were there, the high school was building this incredible rec center, like millions and millions of dollars, right? While we were in North Chicago, and they were basically scraping to get materials for kids in the classroom. So there's these incredible inequities that we saw happening. Okay, so some of the impact of, but that you can see, if you look in the internet, right? Because that data is available. But what was really neat about doing the ethnography and doing interviews and observing in the schools was how funding and community wealth really impacted these schools. And I'll just give you the example of teacher recruitment issues. So one of the things that we found is that, if you have money, you can buy the best people, pretty much. Right? So one of the things that we found, that there was this incredible rating of teachers, that communities will go and rate other communities and bring their teachers on board. And of course, the more affluent communities always won. Those were the ones that offer really competitive salaries, very good working conditions, and people were happy. And so, some of the districts did very well in taking teachers from other districts. Another thing that many of these districts did is that they recruited out of state, particularly for principals and assistant principals. So they would go to Texas, for instance, because they needed some administration that was Latino administrators and bilingual. So they would go out into Texas or into the Southwest to try to recruit people to come. And finally, also one of the communities, North Chicago, which had very little money, they relied on the visiting scholars program, the visiting international teacher program, so they were bringing teachers from Spain, which was very problematic because they don't have the cultural, they have the language, so more or less, but not the cultural and the social content of this kids' life. And finally, the other thing is that some communities have these community and business partners, like Highland Park had donations, incredible stuff that they will get from the community, from businesses in the community to fund their programs. In terms of attitudes and local politics, and this is meshed also with monetary issues, is that, for instance, in terms of Waukegan, which Andy already said have more, and Maria said that have more repressive kind of attitudes, when you go into the high school, you're faced with a metal detector, and then on top of that, you have to present an ID to get into the school. And so you can imagine that for the undocumented population, this is something in a community that is not as welcoming, right? That this is another hurdle that discourages parents to get involved in school. So just little things like that we notice. The other three examples that I have very quickly is during the time, just before we went into the field, there was the issue that Highland Park canceled participation in a basketball tournament for the girls in championship in Arizona, and it was when Arizona had passed its restrictive measures. They decided that they were not going to participate because if they cannot ensure that all the students can participate safely, that they were not going to pull out. Now, there was no undocumented student or immigrant student in the team. It was just the principle behind it. And this says a lot, right, about how this community, the attitudes that translate into this community about supporting their undocumented students. The school also did a lot of initiatives, which I won't talk to, but the one thing that I do want to highlight is that they did have this simultaneous translation at meetings at the school, in which someone had donated, again, community partners, right, had donated the headsets, so that you could have simultaneous translation. So the meetings were run in English, but all the Spanish-speaking parents have the headsets and could hear what's going on in the meeting and could participate in the meeting. And this was very unique of that high school. Just to conclude, I just want to say that I think the integration of these public documents that are available of the survey, the data from the survey, knowing what the attitudes in the community are, but also the interview data really allows for more richer and more in-depth analysis of the impact that these educational practices have on immigrant students. And I just want to say that I touch very lightly on some of the things, but there's a lot of rich data that we have about things that are going on and how these larger policies really translate and have an effect on the everyday life of the students.
Okay, next up is Pam Pilares, who is busy teaching right before this.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So I am reporting on some research on collaborating with one of our PhD students in the department, Tunde Sherpas, who couldn't be here today. We are asking a very simple research question with the survey data from the CAS about the core personal networks of our respondents and to compare the immigrants and non-immigrants. So it's a strictly descriptive approach. So core personal networks are the set of folks who are most closely arranged around us, our strongest ties. For some people, their core personal networks are nobody. For some people, their core personal network might be their spouse or their partner. For others, it might be a wider arrangement of folks. Why is this interesting? There's a raft of research on social networks, particularly the personal networks, that shows that the structure and composition of networks are related with a lot of different kinds of outcomes that we might be interested in. So I just sort of grouped them in three categories, linking the structure and composition of personal networks with our protection and basic services aspect, or access to basic things like food and shelter, our level of physical and mental health, our safety from crime and other kinds of risks, advancement both in the labor market and some interesting research on entrepreneurship, and then engagement in terms of community and politics in various institutions such as school. The network research also, in linking the structure and composition of networks with those various outcomes, talks about various kinds of mechanisms through which they work. A simple way of thinking about some of these mechanisms has to do with networks as pipes or prisms. So the pipes sense is that networks are the avenues through which information, support, material resources, and influence flow. Some other interesting research talks about networks as prisms, that they reflect our reputation, and that those are some of the ways in which people are advanced. And then I've sort of grouped together solidarity and exclusion. We can think about networks as constructing social identity, as constructing and confirming and enforcing norms, and being places where people organize for change. So I just have some brief pictures to orient us to the ideas that we're talking about here. So two hypothetical respondents, Anna and Bernice, and they both have the same number of contacts. So we talk about their network size. Here is 4, but further suppose that for Anna, 3 of her contacts know one another, but for Bernice, her 4 contacts don't know one another. So we talk about Anna as having higher network density than Bernice. Furthermore, we can look at distinguishing the contacts of each of these 2 focal people in terms of various characteristics. So for example, in terms of race and ethnicity. We could say in this case that for Anna, she has 3 contacts who are like her and 1 who is different, so she has a fairly high proportion, same race in her network. Bernice has a 50-50 distribution. There's another way that you can look at the same picture, but now just take Anna and Bernice out and just look at the diversity of the contacts in their networks. All right, so Anna's network has less diversity in it than Bernice's does in the 50-50. So those are some of the things that we can think about. So actually, I'll skip through to here. Basically, what we're doing is looking at a number of, so the purple are the dependent variables that we're looking at, a large number of aspects of core personal networks, their size, their density, their composition in a number of thought of in a number of different ways. And our focal independent variables are differentiating immigrants from non-immigrants. One of the richnesses of the CAS survey is that we have a lot of different ways of distinguishing immigration from not immigration in terms of citizenship, where a person was born, if they are an immigrant, when they came to the United States, what their status is as a legal resident, and then for all respondents, whether their parents were born, so we can get an immigrant generation. Furthermore, since there is a raft of social network research on the antecedents of all of these dependent variables, we control for a lot of other statuses of the respondent herself. So I have some quick results on the basic models here, and then a little bit on one little interaction between race, ethnicity, and some of the immigration statuses. Okay, so the part of the CAS survey that we're using here is the network module. What we did in designing this was use the machinery that's established machinery for collecting core personal networks, one of the established ways, from the General Social Survey, which asks about a person's core personal networks in the following question. Over the last 6 months, with whom have you discussed matters that are important to you? You could imagine answering that question, okay? So the people who are named would be the person's contacts. We ask also about the connections between those people. Do they know each other or not? And then a bunch of characteristics of the contacts. Their gender, race, whether they're kin or a co-worker, how long the respondent has known each of those people. All of that is standard machinery from the General Social Survey. And any of you who knew that social isolation literature that was hue and cry a couple of years ago about was from that research. I added 2 other questions for the CAS in the context of studying immigration for the name interpreters. And so one was whether the contact was born in the United States or not, and where the contact lives. And for the purposes going forward, the first 3 categories we're just generically calling local. If a person lives in your household, in your neighborhood, or in the same town, we'll group those together as local, and non-local being you live further away. All right, so a little bit on the distributions of our focal independent variables. You can see we have some variation in terms of citizenship status and the other variables we're talking about. The strategy is to add the immigration variables separately and controlling for all these other variables, all these other statuses of the individual. So the category, or the results come in 3 different categories. Some differences aren't surprising at all. People who have immigrated to the United States have shorter duration ties, and people who are immigrants under many different categorizations have a higher proportion of immigrants in their networks as well. Probably more interesting is the fact that we found a lack of difference between immigrants and non-immigrants on these multiple measures on all of these dependent variables. So immigrants and non-immigrants are similar in terms of their network size, their proportion female, their proportion kin, a number of other things. There were some differences though, and those have to do with race and diversity. And in particular, the proportion non-white was significantly higher for immigrants. The proportion same race was significantly higher for immigrants, and the racial and ethnic diversity was significantly lower for immigrants. And just speaking sort of crudely about these things, I have 2 brand new interactions that we're wrapping our heads around here. So we're predicting proportion same race in the network here, and I've separated out whites, blacks, and others in the blue category. Whites and blacks don't differ significantly in terms of their proportion same race. And there aren't enough Asians for me to estimate that line. But what we see here is comparing, on the bottom screen here, is comparing respondents whose parents weren't born in the US, so they're first or second generation immigrants themselves, to people whose parents were born in the US, so people who are third or later generation immigrants. And so what we see is for blacks and whites, they have similarly homophilous networks, high proportion, same race. For first or second generation Latinos, they have also a very high proportion, same race, but for third and later generation, a much lower proportion, same race. And looking at immigration in a slightly different way, again predicting proportion, same race, same racial categories. But here on the bottom axis you have entered the US after 1986, so very recent immigrants, entered before 1986, more established immigrants, and then born in the United States. And again, for whites, blacks, and others, it's kind of a flat line, and for Latinos and Asians, you see a decrease over time. I'm wrapping my minds around this at this point. The interpretation that I'm thinking of at this point has to do with opportunity structures through which people are meeting, making, and solidifying their core personal contacts, and that for immigrants they tend to be much more racially constrained opportunity structures, but in the later generations, and as they've spent more time in the United States, they move into opportunity structures that are more diverse. Just skip, because we're done. But the question really remaining for the difference is whether it is about opportunity structures or whether it's about self-segregation or about exclusion. And the similarities too are also sort of interesting to me. If the network structures are the same, the question is, do they produce the same advantages and disadvantages through the same mechanisms? So those are some other directions to go. Thank you.
Okay, now we have the first of our two graduate student presenters, Emily, who won a department paper prize for this paper. So this is an award-winning 10-minute version of an award-winning paper.
Okay, well, thank you. My research is a little bit different than what we've heard. When I went into this project, I was very fortunate, first of all, to be able to start my program at UIC while this project was going on. And we were really encouraged to see if we could use the data for our master's theses. And so I really was interested in using CAS, but I was interested in looking at more hidden populations, more invisible populations. So what I decided to do is look at a population that has had very, very little research about unaccompanied minors. Now, unaccompanied minors is kind of a legal term that's not very well defined. Even if you go to the U.S. immigration website, they will say we don't really have a good definition. It kind of depends on the context. But what I was looking at for unaccompanied minors were basically youth who had come to the United States by themselves. So the legal definition is anybody under the age of 18 who's an immigrant in the United States by themselves without parents or any legal guardians. But I was also looking at youth who had just crossed by themselves and then ended up living by themselves while they were in the United States. Now, I first became aware of this population, and I think many of us first became aware of this population with this 2006 book written by Sonia Nazario, who is a journalist who followed a young man from Latin America as he traveled by himself across Mexico and into the U.S. And I was also introduced to unaccompanied minors through some work I was doing. I was in Michigan as a social worker working in a refugee resettlement agency. And in that program, there was a lot of unaccompanied minors who had crossed the border by themselves, had been detained by immigration, and then put into the social service system in the U.S. So there's a little bit of research done on this particular population, especially because they're already part of the U.S. social service and immigration system. But I was thinking, what about the kids who come here and don't get involved in some sort of social services? So I was really interested in looking at kids who immigrate by themselves and then start a life by themselves. And using CIS data, I thought I'd be looking at networks, from Latin America and Mexico to Chicago, and then also kind of the social services maybe that they did tap in. But as you all know, I'm sure research never goes as you think it's going to go. So the story that I actually was able to get, or actually before I get to that, what I did using CIS data was go Most of this is through CAS and the suburbs, as we've talked about. And I was able to, through cold calling churches, through stopping at schools and working with some of the schools that some of the other speakers have spoken about, I was able to find some of these kids, teenagers, and really adults who had come to the United States as unaccompanied minors. And I was able to identify 17 in the Chicago area. So I interviewed all of these young men. Most of them were adults by the time I interviewed them. But they had all come to the United States between the ages of 13 and 17, again, crossing by themselves and living by themselves or with other men that were not their legal guardians. So I was able to interview all of these young men about their experiences. And as I said, the stories that I collected were a lot different than I had expected. The stories that I got from these young men were really more, not so much about networks as I thought they would be, or even about trauma. They were stories about becoming men. And this was something that was very surprising to me, but as I've looked more at the literature, it's something that people have started to develop in terms of understanding immigrant men and the role of immigration in their identity. Now, my intervention here is that I'm not looking at only men, but I'm looking at really boys and kids who use immigration as part of the way they develop their identities into adults and simultaneously into men. So there's a lot of different findings that I could talk about, but for the sake of time, we'll just be looking at three main things. The first thing that was uncovered by this research is that the young men who come to the United States are coming into what other scholars have called bachelor communities. And I was kind of shocked at the amount of interaction they had with other men and the lack of interaction that they had with women. So the first thing that I noticed is that when they would talk to me about who they first lived with upon arrival to the United States, they would say, I knew a friend who knew a guy, and I ended up getting into this living situation that had, for example, one of my participants, Luis Valdez, said he lived in a 2-bedroom household with 18 other men. A couple of my participants that I worked with in the suburbs were all part of a country club. They were all workers at the country club. The country club has a dormitory for all of their immigrant workers. So in this dormitory, there were 36 men and 1 woman. Another guy talked about working at, I think, a meatpacking plant in the suburbs, and he said as part of the meatpacking plant, he lived in a trailer. This is not the exact trailer, but a trailer similar to this. And he said there were 14 other men living with him in this trailer. So I was really impressed by just the level of interaction. And then when participants talked about the importance of other people in their life, it was really a story of mentorship. I had actually a whole series of men who said, I would talk to them and I would say, when you got here, you were 15 years old. Who did you talk to? Or, who gave you help? And they would say, well, I know this other guy who also came when he was really young. So they would send me to him. And then that guy would say, well, I know this other guy who also came when he was 16. So I'd be sent along kind of these snowball paths. I was very impressed with the type of mentorship. As we'll talk about in a second, one thing that was very important for a lot of my participants was this idea of kind of building a new life. Morality and hard work were really important, and the mentorship that they were providing each other was really confirming this as a part of their identity. So a second interesting finding, as I mentioned, I expected when I was going out to talk with young men who had left their homes, left their families as early as age 13, had undertaken a very dangerous journey, I expected to hear stories about danger and about trauma and violence. And I certainly did hear these stories, but I was often very much surprised at how they were framed. So many times the young men would say, when I thought about going to the United States, I thought it was going to be an adventure. One, for example, he immigrated at age 15. He says, I thought crossing the border was going to be like an adventure, like getting to know, like walking through the country in my town, because in my town there are mountains and I'm familiar with it. I thought it would be like that. Another guy said it was, for me, it was like an adventure, like something different, something dangerous, something fun. When I was young, I liked to do different things that made me feel alive. So, and I heard this type of story over and over, and again, it surprised me. There was definitely a framing of this very dangerous dangerous crossing in terms of, I'm going to prove myself as a man. A couple of the guys talked about what happened to them when they went over the border and how other people in the group that they traveled with couldn't do it. They would talk about women fainting. They would talk about like their friends not being able to carry this backpack, and so they would be the ones that would like carry the backpacks or help the women. So it was very much this story of bravery. Other scholars have called this kind of a male quest story. Now, that's not to say that everybody framed it as this exciting adventure experience, and I certainly had participants talking about some of the tragedies that they experienced, and one man in particular had a really difficult time talking about his crossing, and yet he still, it's actually this first quote, despite the fact that he had had some really, really difficult experiences, he could still talk about this idea of, I thought it was going to be an adventure. I thought this is what I was getting myself into. Now the last very brief finding that I'll talk about is that many of the young men, when they talked about their reasons for wanting to go to the US, they were very complex. Of course, there was economic reasons. Some of them, like I said, talked about just wanting an adventure, wanting to try something new. But I also heard this pattern of stories that was about wanting to have the opportunity to become a new type of man. Pablo Ramirez says, if I would have stayed in my home, I might have become a thug or a killer or something. I might have started stealing or something, because when one is young, well, life seems easy. And all of my friends at that age did that. They stayed in Mexico to do that, to do drugs and all that. And I didn't like it. I never liked doing drugs and all that. I fled from that. So for some of these young men, immigration was a way that they could see themselves starting a new life, having the opportunity to have a job that could give them money, that could give them security without having to, go into the type of life that they saw as their only option. So immigration very much became this this way of creating a new self, a new type of man. And again, this is a story that I heard multiple times. So, of course, this is just very brief, and I think there's a lot more that can be taken away from both the CAS data about unaccompanied minors, and I think in general, this is a population that's very, very much under researched, and I really encourage social scientists to start looking more at this population. So, thank you.
Vanessa, who is a PhD student in the Department of Political Science, and she is the grand poobah of our qualitative data set, so she knows every interview that's there, so she'll be the go-to person.
If you find a name that sounds a little wonky, it's because you're not throwing out options.
Yeah, she gave names to 451 some people.
Like Maria said, I'm in the political science department. My dissertation looks at immigrant political incorporation, and particularly Latinos. And I really focused on Waukegan, was kind of what drew me in. Kind of what Andy said, it's one of the locations that had the most aggressive anti-immigrant legislations, but it's also one of the population cities that has the highest percentage of Latinos in the city. And I couldn't work it into my presentation, but at the very end I have a chart so that you can see the population, the demographic change, because I just think it's really cool. And of course, kind of like Emily said, once you get into the field, it's very different than what you expected. One of the things that I did not expect, and again, I think that being able to work with a research team like CAS was instrumental in my dissertation, because we had so many people on the field over 2 years that we were really able to talk to, and I can confidently say almost every single Latino leader within Waukegan. And the reason I know that is because when you finish the interview, you say, well, who else should I talk to? You start hearing the same names, and you're like, well, I already talked to them. Or, so-and-so, I already talked to them. Do you have anyone else? And so when you see that you run out and you pretty much have everyone in the data, it makes it's completely mind-blowing when you're actually starting to do it. So one of the things that came out in reading and hearing and talking to all the Latino leaders is that there was a clear division within the Latino leadership. For example, in Waukegan 287G, the measure that Andy talked about, basically the city council proposed to give federal immigration, give a local law enforcement the ability to enforce federal immigration law. What's really interesting is that that measure was introduced by a Latino alderman in Waukegan, right? So then it started thinking, well, what does representation mean? What does it mean to be incorporated? Is it enough to be a Latino to say that you represent? And the answer is, not quite the same. So my research question is, how does intra-group diversity and local context impact Latino political participation? So in order to answer that question, I've developed two models, the Latino analytical model and the contextual model, because context really mediates the way that these groups interact. So based on a model developed by Suburban and Ortiz, who are really not looking at political participation, so I've tweaked their model a little bit, and looking at an axis of constraint and engagement. Constraint being all of the things that can serve as barriers to political participation, and not just legal barriers, so being undocumented can be a barrier, but also not speaking English, not feeling comfortable in the American system. All of these more nuanced barriers are in the vertical axis, and then the horizontal axis I have engagement and your choice, whether you choose to be involved or choose to not for whatever reasons, right? So there are many reasons why people may choose not to. In the interest of time, I'm not going to speak about the disengaged categories. If at the end people have questions about them, I'd be happy to go back into them, but my research is really focused on how participation works and leadership, so I'm really not looking at people who, for whatever reason, choose to not participate. So we're just going to move on to the other two categories. So the first kind of subset, Latino category, and I don't want to make categories, there's a lot of fluidity between all these, and you see people transitioning from one group to the other, so I'm not trying to suggest a very static relationship among these, but what I found is that there was this group of highly engaged and unconstrained Latino leaders, and I call them the professional representatives. For the most part, they were 1.5 and second generation Latinos and more. They had high education levels. They didn't have any overt barriers to participation, and actually made it very clear to use all of their resources to become very involved. And I deal a lot with the social and cultural capital that they had that enabled them to become these professional representatives. Again, the proficiency in English, the legal status, the ability to maneuver in both of these worlds. And more importantly, they were recognized by local power structures, and by that I mean the PTA, the city council, the library board. These are the individuals that they identified as, when we need to learn about the Latino community for whatever reason, these are the individuals that we talk to. This is your go-to person. And so their kind of role, in a way, is maintaining the status quo. They are the mediators between the Latino community and these kind of local power structures. So I call them the professional representatives. And then you have this other group who are highly engaged but constrained, and I call them the activists. They are mainly first generation and 1.5 generation Latino leaders. They have multiple barriers and constraints to participation. Many are undocumented or have varying legal statuses that preclude them from participating electorally, for example. And their cultural capital is different. It's not that they don't have cultural capital, obviously, but that their cultural capital is a different set of tools, so that the way that they participate, their political participation looks different. They're proficient in Spanish and may speak English as well, but they're much more connected to the community, and so when the community is looking for a leader, when the community has a question, a person in the church, they say, well, this is the person I talk to about these things. This person's the one who knows. So they are the ones who, if you look at the other side, who are the real representatives of the Latino community, you need these people. These are the individuals that the professional representatives cannot mobilize the Latino community without them. So they don't have pull, and if anything, you see the individuals in the community sometimes speak negatively about them, like, oh, I don't trust her, she thinks, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of us and them between these two groups, and even though at times they have come together to accomplish a specific goal, for example, 287G, there was a huge movement around it, the two groups worked together to kind of stop it, and what happened, even though the city council petitioned to ICE for these rights, there was such a big commotion about it that ICE decided to not touch it, and then eventually a new mayor was elected who retracted that. So they did come together at that one point, but that quickly fell apart. And so these two groups have at times varying political interests. the activists are very much interested in challenging the status quo. And so when we speak of, particularly in political science, we're horrible about speaking about the Latino community as this very monolithic thing. When you start looking at it, it's actually much more complex, and there's very different constituencies happening. My research compares Chicago and Waukegan. And so what I find that in Waukegan, you have the Latino community who talks to their activists, who then talk to the Latino professionals, who then represent them to local power structures. Whereas in Chicago, it's not an ideal thing. This isn't like flawless that they can just pick up the phone and talk to whoever, but there's much more direct lines of access. So for example, the inability to speak English is not going to stop someone from being able to talk to their aldermanic representative or to go to a PTA meeting, and the environment is much more conducive to kind of having those direct lines. And so what I find is that context really matters. So you have these individuals, right, these archetypes of Latinos, but then where they are really matters of how they participate. So I have a contextual model, and a lot up there, and I don't know, so I don't really have to dig into it, but basically I look at context in 3 different categories: spatial organization, local history, and social networks. And basically all of these things create an environment that either facilitate or inhibit that ease of interaction between groups. And just quickly, because I can't help myself. But basically you can see that in 1980, Waukegan, the orange is the white population, and then you can see that just decline, and then Latino population just explodes, right? So it's a very quick transition, and I think that that's why you have some of these, the anti-immigrant population and that sentiment, and then the political representation not catching up to it, and then aside from the internal divisions that are going on. So,
Okay, thank you. Yes. I think we have a few minutes.
Pretty much. Yeah.
We'll have a few minutes for Q&A, but mostly this was teasers, so hopefully you'll reach out to authors for more on their work. And like I said, as you can see, we have a lot of data, and we're looking for a few good edits. So, questions? Chris?
Yeah, have you, this is a really incredible graph I presume that other communities you looked at didn't have this. I mean, the fact that African Americans almost exactly the same as this, I mean, that's not the pattern of other communities, right? Slower, faster.
Round Lake Beach had fast, like the highest percentage increase in Latino immigrants of all of these communities. But it doesn't have a African American population to speak of though, so it was really
It's faster than this.
yeah, I think so. Because it started with a very small number.
Yeah, right.
It started very small, and yeah.
I think it was really in the 90s where it just like,
But you see the same thing in Highwood, very similar patterns. In Highland Park, it didn't really change. I mean, it's grown from maybe 2 or 3% Latino to 5 or 6. I mean, it's a very small increase in the Latino population in Highland Park, but right next door, Highwood, you see this pattern. This is.
to get a sense of how tight Highland Park and Highwood are, I mean, I don't know if you know, Highwood is actually like a little sliver inside Highland Park, and you can actually, I mean, the researchers that we had there doing the surveys, they didn't use cars, like they literally just walked, because you don't need a car. I mean, you walk 3 more blocks and you're in Highland Park, right? So it's like a tiny, tiny little sliver inside of Highland.
In fact, I think between the survey and the in-depth interviews, we probably talked to everybody in Highwood. Or at least tried to talk to everybody in Highwood. A lot of people refused our
Or everybody knows somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
The reason I was asking about that is, did you see any correlation? I mean, I know you've got a tiny n here, but correlation between the sort of pattern of change and the receptivity or antagonism towards we originally started off talking about?
Well, I think that, I mean, I don't have an answer, but I mean, demographically, I think the interesting contrast with Waukegan is Round Lake Beach, because they had an equally explosive increase, yet from all that, and you guys that did the ethnography, from all that we know, they had very welcoming and supportive policies. So it wasn't a speed of transition. I mean,
Which I think that in Round Lake, it actually is not as welcoming
as it sounds, as it seemed from the library.
No, in fact, they actually were the one local government. So I did the interviews with the city councils, and they were the ones who stonewalled me the most. They would not let me talk to them on record. They wouldn't even just to get an interview with them. It was like pulling teeth. They acted as if I was, a covert. I was gonna, I don't know. There was a lot of Tea Party sentiment, and I don't know if this is in reaction to the explosive growth, and now that these people have been elected into office, or exactly, I could not get at that story. They literally, I would show up and listen to the meetings, and everyone else was very welcoming. In fact, at one of the Round Lake City Council meetings, I had a young woman who had just been elected, and she was very encouraging, and she's like, yes, talk to me, she even set up a time, and then by the time that day came around, she was no longer available. She wouldn't pick up my phone calls. She wouldn't answer my emails. There was absolutely we're not talking to you. And the one person who did talk to me was very did not provide hardly any information. The one person who spoke to me on record was very ambivalent. So.
One of the differences, though, of course, between Round Lake Beach and Waukegan is the history, right? That Waukegan's been the county seat, it's 100 years old, and Round Lake Beach was nothing a couple of decades ago, right?
The lake resort.
So the explosive growth in the Latino population came with the growth of the city itself, and that can affect something about the entrenched interests.
Yeah, and then in the 1950s, Waukegan actually had a really vibrant Latino community.
Yeah.
The Puerto Rican Association was very, very strong, and whenever there's books written about a mayor in Waukegan, and they talk about the Latino constituency as having, being a group that she needed to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just first want to say, so I'm from Waukegan, and I work at Great Cities, and so I just wanted to thank you guys for doing all this much work, and I'll definitely be in touch about data.
Good.
So one of my questions was just a general question about how you selected the sites, because what I find, generally speaking, in Lake County is that it's a very segregated county, and so the communities that you selected, with the exception of Highland Park, are really the places where there are Latinos, and everywhere else, except for like Mundelein and Zion, there really aren't Latinos at all. And I find it mostly along economic barriers, and that's why with Highland Park, there's not really Latinos much because it's so expensive to live there. And so I was just wondering how you selected. It was because there were Latinos, so you could then survey that, or?
Right. So I'll answer part of the question, then Neil can give you the real answer. But in an ideal world with unlimited resources, the first version of this project that we laid out had places that had Latino immigrants and places that didn't, right? That's what you'd really like to have. But then the cold hard reality of money comes into play, and we decided we were more interested in understanding variation within different kinds of contexts that did have a Latino population. That was just a design decision that we made, and then within that.
Yeah, so one of the things is, with those constraints that Maria is talking about, first we were looking all around the metropolitan area, but logistically that would be a nightmare. You cannot go to Aurora and then run to Elgin and then run, it was just we had to concentrate on one area. So that was part of the reason why. The other thing in selecting the sites is that mostly Maria and I worked a lot on looking, believe me, I looked at census data. We looked at a lot of stuff, and we decided ultimately to try to go for diversity of communities, so we took Highland Park and Highwood as a dyad of a very wealthy community, but yet, you had, in terms of the schools, for instance, you had the kids of the maids and the gardeners going to school with the kids who live in those houses, right, that their parents serviced. And so we wanted to look at sort of those dynamics. We also were interested in Waukegan because of the restrictive policies, but also North Chicago. And North Chicago is actually deceptive because on the books it appears as being 1/3 white, 1/3 Black and 1/3 Latino, but it's really not. All the whites live in the military base. That's where the Great Lakes Naval Base is, and the whites are the officers. And they don't send their children to the schools. They don't have anything to do with North Chicago. They live behind the white picket fences. Their children actually go to Highland Park, to high school. And so, so there was, you couldn't tell, driving through North Chicago, you know that you don't see any white people, right? And so, so that was another, we wanted to look in the context of what we thought at the beginning was an integrated community that had 1/3 Black, 1/3 Latino. Actually, when we got there, we discovered, the white people are behind those fences. And then Wakanda, we added at the end. We wanted Round Lake because it was sort of an excerpt. And one of the things the sense that we got from people in Round Lake was that some of the positive views were like it was nothing until Latinos got there. And at the time that Latinos got there, that's when you start getting Home Depot and all these places. So they see development going alongside the growth of Latinos. And then Wakanda we added at the end because Wakanda is a rural hub, right? Wakanda is a satellite for the farming communities, and that's where a lot of the horse stables and are in that area. And so we wanted to look sort of like city, Waukegan, to suburb, exurb, rural area. So we wanted to have those degrees, but then also have economic differences between communities and also racial differences within communities. So we wanted to kind of have these combinations to see, if race matter, if income, education, and things like that matter.
Because I anecdotally find the same ambivalence at the county level, but it's like mostly because white people live in Vernon Hills and these other places, and they just don't go walking in unless they have to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the
Yeah.
ambivalence is there for sure. And I've also noticed that like a lot of people who live in some of those other towns are former Waukegan people, but they left. And so a lot of the white people that stayed around in Waukegan are ambivalent or sometimes positive, I think, with Latino immigrants.
Yeah.
I have a question for Vanessa. So I find this fascinating. Latino professionals. I write a little bit about this. I call them middlemen, middlewomen, right? Or brokers, right? And so this idea of highly engaged, you're focused on highly engaged folks. And I'm wondering, in regards to politics, if there are tensions between among Latinos regarding perhaps if there are those who are aligned with the current administration, who might be politically appointed to positions, as opposed to those who might be activists, who might say, well, yes, this is thank you for appointing a Latino representative, but this is really a token or a puppet. And I'm wondering if those things exist. I'm not saying they do, but I'm wondering if there's intergroup tensions exist.
I mean, there's so much tension between these two groups. They actively do not like each other.
Yeah.
I mean, at times they just speak of each other. They don't trust each other. They know that they need to come together for specific things, but they don't agree on things. So, for example, the Latino professionals, there's a lot of they want to get things done by appointments, electorally, by having closed door meetings, and so they actively look down at the activists who criticize them. They're like, if you make a closed door meeting, then how is the community going to know what you did? How are we going to hold you accountable? We want to take it to the streets. And so then the professionals are like, you guys are just kind of disorganized, you just want to always go protesting, and the other guys are like, you just want to keep it in the back door, and kind of. So there's a lot of tension between these two groups, and those who do work in government and have been appointed, people see them as allies, right? Like the activists are like, I need to speak with this person to get X thing, but I don't trust that person, further than this very limited kind of interaction. So there's a lot of fracturing.
Can I add something? Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to context me. So one of the people who I would probably classify in this professional group, Latino professionals, actually ran for mayor in Waukegan last year, and she got like 900 votes. She couldn't get the Latino base.
She's one of the person I spoke to quite a bit. She was very forthcoming with me and really open. But if you spoke to the community, they did not like her. And when she spoke about the community, she did not see themselves as part of them. She spoke of them and not of us. And I think that that's something that really resonates with the activists in the community who are, like, are you one of us? Are you el pueblo, right? And she was most definitely not.
And part of it too was that a lot of people associated her with the ICE thing.
Yes.
She was under the
She worked-
administration of the mayor who did the ICE thing.
I have an interview with Mayor Hyde.
And to be fair, he's probably one of the most explosive, controversial mayors that Washington has ever had, like, period.
Oh, I sat down and spoke with him for about 2 hours and kind of killed my soul.
Exactly.
It's a great interview, lots of data, very colorful. Took one for the team. I went to the bathroom halfway through and I'm like, I can do this because I really just want to walk out.
So we're with the Center for Economic Progress, and we've been doing work in Waukegan for a bit around economic development. And one of the biggest struggles we've seen is, and we've seen this in other communities, we've seen very progressive communities that have found that middle person or that middle ground where you get the professionals, the activists, and the CBOs together and you form some kind of a network to meet these needs. We've had such a hard time finding that in Waukegan. We know it doesn't exist, not even close to being in existence. And it's a scary thought because without that piece, you can't get anywhere in a community like that. My question to you, knowing that that doesn't exist and that it's a continuous struggle, do you see any uptrend in let's say the lower income Latino community stepping up and saying, you know, we really want to take control of our community and build it, or do you see just kind of a stagnant response to that?
I mean, there is hope, right? When 2017 popped out, these two communities did form, I can't remember the real name, but the Suburban is the Community Alliance Task Force or something like that. And so they did come together very effectively, and they did come together and support Savage and were able to get a mayor elected. So it is possible if they have the right motivation.
Yeah.
But what you find with the activists and part is that, one, they're really severely underfunded. I mean, they're working really kind of out of their houses, and so they don't have the resources to kind of put together a massive or a more cohesive thing. They're really kind of dealing with putting out fires. And so I think that there's the desire, but then there's also the part of the community of, look, right now what I need to do is I need to get to work and I need to, you know what I mean? Like, you don't really have the time, or people, even when it comes to like immigration rights, like in Know Your Rights campaigns, most people aren't interested in Know Your Rights campaigns until they need to and they actually have a problem, right? And so it's the same thing, more broader. So I mean, I think that's something you find pretty much everywhere.
Maybe a last question.
Yeah.
So when you presented to the community of various folks, when's the area?
I'm not sure those of us here, have you done?
I have
Yeah, the representatives of people who have done that have, like Neil that has just left, able to answer that question. Sorry.
This was wonderful. One last question.
Well, actually, I was going to ask, so kind of thinking on the political incorporation, but also the social network aspect. In terms of, I guess, interracial, I don't want to say collaboration, but interracial kind of, I guess, are coalitions around, some of these heated political issues. I mean, do you find there to be either, white and black, white Latino, black Latino, group work, or, do you find in the social network analysis, there being interactions beyond kind of the workplace into really kind of developing these, these interracial communities? I mean, or is it still kind of?
I mean, I'm thinking about in Waukegan and like more like what groups happening, and the Latinos can't get them together themselves, and they're definitely not interested or not looking to actively. There's someone who will have an attempt and they'll want to, but most of these organizations that I've seen, like any type of are either church-based and it's a very specific, there's not a lot of mixing, and it's not. I mean, I haven't seen evidence of any rainbow coalitions about to pop up.
My sense from what we've done is that the survey respondents, blacks and whites, are sort of in their own little worlds. And that, I don't know how much it's driven by the picture of North Chicago that Nilda was just painting a moment ago, but that's a little bit of what it looks like. My sense is that for the immigrants, both Latinos and Asians, and that they're, as over time, they're moving into places where they're coming more in contact with whites more so than with blacks. That would be my thought from what the survey data is saying.
Thanks again, everybody, for
Thank
coming
you.
out.